Okay. As I say, we've met one or two famous women from this early modern period, but mostly in their role as queen. What about other women? I will go back over those women a little bit just to remind you. As I say, history, this idea that it's his story, that it's focused on men, is partly because the society itself has been patriarchal. Patriarchal means based on the pater, the father, the man. Matriarchy is a society that's based on the leadership of women in the society. So we tend to see history in terms of the actions and lives of men. And we've seen women of the period in three basic contexts. Firstly, mostly really as royalty. And there's been the wives of Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, feature as particularly very highly educated and capable women of their time. If you remember, Catherine Aragon was the first and only woman who was an ambassador for her country. All right, before she actually married the king. She'd married the king's elder brother, if you remember, and then he died, and there were several years which she had to fill finding some position for herself, and she did that very powerfully, becoming an ambassador for her country. So these women, the wives of Henry VIII, certainly stick out in our minds. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, we talked about in some detail. Then we've got Mary I and Elizabeth I, the two daughters that Henry had. And again, they stand out, particularly Elizabeth as a highly educated woman, Mary for her Catholic beliefs and her very strict policies towards Protestants, if you remember, and Elizabeth, again, a very highly educated woman. We saw at a young age, she was translating books from French, and she was, writing poetry, and she spoke, I don't know how many languages, okay, fluently. We get Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots during that period. We get Lady Jane Grey, the 9-Day Queen. So there's quite, especially this is all in the 16th century, there's quite a list of powerful women back there in the 16th century who occupied highly important positions. The other role in which we've seen women was in the role of being religious martyrs, and we said that that was quite important because it was used. Do you remember when I gave that presentation on suffering in early modern times and how the government would use the suffering of women as a way to convince the rest of the society that it should be patient in accepting its suffering? Because if women could put up with those kinds of things, surely you men should be able to do at least that much. Particularly the names of Anne Askew and Alice Driver stand out for their very brave deaths, which were used again and again in the political rhetoric of the 16th and into the 17th century. And I think you remember the terrible torture that Anne Askew was put to, the martyrdoms, the burnings, all these terrible things. And the fact that women endured that kind of suffering was used as a sort of political tool even though the number of women concerned was not very huge, but they were used politically. So it's an important role to think about when we think about women in those days. And finally, as witches, which I mentioned a little bit about, but haven't said all that much. So really that's all we've seen of women so far. You remember in Europe, witches were burned, and we often have the image of witches being burned. Actually, in England, they were hanged. Okay? And we talked a little bit about women in literature, not very much at all, really, but a little bit. I talked about Mary Sidney Herbert, the Countess of Pembroke, whose work was at the time compared with the work of Shakespeare. She's not remembered as, obviously, Shakespeare is the great writer of the time, but at the time, people considered her to be a very accomplished writer. And so here's a woman appearing in literature and taking a fairly important position. And something to notice here, there had been women writers before, in the 15th century, in the 14th century. Julian of Norwich, Marjorie Kemp. I won't go into all those people now because they come before our period. There had been these women who were writers, but guess what? They always only wrote about religion. All right? Women who were nuns in those convents which Henry VIII closed down, they were basically religious women, and they wrote about their religious experiences. So here we've got a woman who is, for the first time, making herself well known through writings that are not just about religion. Okay? A lot of it is fiction, kind of romance fiction. It's not exactly lovers' romance. It's sort of it's imagining a world of adventure where people are heroes and people do brave things and they have exciting adventures. It's an early form of fiction. They didn't really have the novel, the shosetsu like we talk about it now, really comes later on, but it's kind of an early version of a novel. And she was famous for that and for her drama as well. As I say, Julian of Norwich, Marjorie Kemp, these writers of the 14th and 15th centuries, they wrote religious literature. Okay. Here you can see Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp, writers of the medieval period, the 14th and 15th centuries. Julian of Norwich is the first woman known to have written a book in English. And Marjorie Kemp is the first woman to have written about her life, or in fact to have written the first woman or man. She kind of created a new form of literature, a new genre in English literature by writing the story of her life. It's based on her religious life, and her life, it focuses largely on religion, but she was not, unlike Julian of Norwich, who was a nun, Shisuta, she was not actually living the religious life. She writes about religion, but she was living a normal life. In fact, she was a businesswoman, This is interesting. It was not unusual for women to have their own kaisha, their own business. She made beer, okay, for example. She was a businesswoman, and she had a very interesting life, traveling. In those days, people would travel because of religion. They would make a special religious journey called a pilgrimage. Pilgrimage. The person is a pilgrim, and the journey is a pilgrimage. You might remember Cantabari Monogatari, Geoffrey Chaucer. Okay, he writes about pilgrims. They're going on a journey from London to Canterbury. They're walking. It's going to take several days. So they tell each other stories. And the stories they tell become the Canterbury Tales, the Cantabari Monogatari. So in her case, she went on a much, much longer pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to the Middle East. So she had a very interesting life. You'll remember again what I said about convents and how important they were for women's education. And she was, Julian of Norwich, was of that kind of woman who became educated inside the convents, inside the context of the religious life. Okay? She probably got her education inside. There were different types of just like in Japanese, you've got Nichiren Buddhism, you've got different types of Buddhism, you've got different schools. In the same way, in Christianity, there would be different. Benedictines was one group of nuns and monks. And then after the Reformation, we get secular schools. That means shukyo to kankei nai. They're not connected with religion. They're independent schools, independent of the church. And as I said before, those schools were nearly all for boys, and things actually got worse for women at that time. It became harder for women to get an education. Okay. And Marjorie Kemp, as I say, she was a religious mystic, but she was also a family woman. She had at least 14 children. She was a businesswoman. She was a traveller. She went to various parts of Europe. She went to Jerusalem. So her autobiography is a very interesting window into Chusei Jidai, Middle Ages, and the life that people had at that time. And interestingly, probably she could not read and she could not write. But because she was a successful businesswoman, she had money. So she could pay somebody to write it down. Okay? She spoke the words and somebody else wrote it down. Probably. Okay? So the person who wrote it down is called a scribe. It was a professional job in those days because lots of people couldn't read or write. So they would speak it and the scribe would write it down for them. And probably her work was not written by her own hand, but spoken by her and written down by a scribe. It's an example of how difficult it was for women to get education in those days, even if she was rich. Okay. So moving on then to, that's all happening before our period. That's all Chusei Jidai, 14th, 15th centuries. Moving on into the 16th century, Tudor and Stuart England, businesses continued to be, not often, but sometimes, run by women. The kinds of business was fairly limited, and the situation would very often be the man starts the company, he dies, his wife carries on. That would very often be the situation. Marjorie Kemp, as I said, she made beer and she had a grain mill, which was, people would bring their grain and at her mill they would grind the grain into flour. And they were quite popular businesses for women because they were done at home. They were kind of home-run businesses. You don't have to go anywhere to do that. You do it. You set it up at home. So that was a popular kind of business for women. Textiles, dressmaking, yappari. Okay, if you were going to think about it, you might think, yes, that sounds like women's work. Even into the 19th century, or perhaps even today, women dominated. Women were the main producers, or they became the main producers. It was very typical for women to be running those kinds of businesses. Printing presses. As I say, usually after the death of the husband, the printing press would carry on. The woman would run the press after her husband died. So quite a lot of books from this time were actually printed by women. Okay. But basically, it was a man's world. Working women were a minority. It was unusual for women to gain an apprenticeship. The trades took training, and that kind of training usually went to men. I'll give you some examples. I'll give you an example here. In 1681, this is much later, of course, this is towards the end of the 17th century, but it's an example. We have the paperwork of Mary Harrison. We know that there were more than 100 apprentices to the trade of drapery. Now, drapery is the clothing trade. As I said, it was not unusual for women to be in dressmaking, but out of more than 100 in London at the end of the 17th century, only 6 of them are women. One of them was Mary Harrison. And we still have the paperwork. This is the official paper that allows her to become an apprentice, to learn how to be a draper, how to do that job professionally. And if we look at this paperwork, I'm sorry, the quality, the quality is terrible, isn't it? I hope that we're going to be able to see a little bit in more detail here. Notice on the first line it says he, and then somebody by hand has put an S, she, because the expectation was it will be a man. So the printed piece of paper was all written out for a man, and then somebody by hand changed it to she, because it was a woman, in fact. Okay, can you see that? All right. They assumed that apprentices were going to be men. And we can see it from the official paper. Right? They didn't expect women. Even 6 out of 102 is not nothing, is it? It's still something. But basically the expectation was it'll be a man. And that carries on. It's supposed to be his master, because an apprentice learns from a master. The master teaches the young person how to do the job. And that might take 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. But after they've done the training, then they were themselves professionals for that job. But it says, again, it supposes that the person running the business will also be a man. But in this case, she is a woman, the young apprentice, and the master is not a man. The master is a mistress. Okay, the woman is a woman running the company. So it's a young woman learning from an older woman. And they have to change both of the language. They have to change the language for the young woman, and they have to change the language for the master, who is actually a mistress. So it shows you just how strong the idea was that it's men who do these kinds of things. Okay, and again, it's himself, but they've changed, they put in an R to make it herself. Education. I've said a little bit about this perhaps before. We got humanist philosophy, which is early modern philosophy is dominated by something called Christian humanism. It's based on Christianity, but it's moving more towards saying our life in this world is important. If you remember the Chusei Jidai, the medieval idea of Christianity was pretty kind of strict, pretty kibishi. Your life here in this world is not important. Right? You live just to go to heaven or to hell. But Christian humanism is much more interested in the quality of life. Inside a Christian context, inside a Christian way of thinking, and famous people like Thomas More, the Spaniard Juan Luis Vives, who came to teach the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Mary, and Roger Ascham, they all promoted women's education quite strongly, but they're only effective inside the elite, the upper class elite. They're not really reaching the ordinary people. They're only inside the very high class elite. There was a Richard Mulcaster who lived in the Elizabethan period, and he believed that everybody, rich and poor, men and women, everybody should get an elementary education, but his influence was limited. It was not until the 19th century, okay, the idea of giving everyone an elementary education, that didn't come in until 1860, hundreds of years later, okay? In fact, pretty late, really. Other European countries were earlier, all right? I think it's 1860. I'm not very good on dates sometimes, but it's around about then, okay? So, of course, in the 16th century, 17th centuries, that idea just didn't exist. Most people, rich or poor, most women, even rich women, got very little education. And the poor people, anyway, men or women, they got no education, really, usually. So the bottom line is that most women got little or no education. And then you start to get the Puritan system. The Puritans, as we noticed, start becoming, well, they've been Unusai from the beginning. They've been kind of pushing for their ideas, but they get more and more insistent, and their ideas are getting more and more power. We're going to have, of course, Oliver Cromwell, and we're going to have a Puritan government in the middle of the century. And starting from the earlier part of the century, Puritan ideas start to come in, and they are not good ideas for women. It's not a good time for women. So that although in the 16th century things were a little bit more open, things started to close down And the idea was very strongly that women were there to help their husbands, they were there to look after the children, they weren't there for anything else. They were definitely in a lower position. This was very much the Puritan way of seeing women. And the new king, James I, didn't help at all. We said he was possibly gay, he's probably gay, or at least bisexual, and he doesn't seem to have had very much respect for women. For example, his own daughter was offered a classical education, and he said, no, don't give her an education. And the reason, to make women learned and foxes tame has the same effect, to make them more cunning. Give women an education and you become Zurui. Okay? So he didn't trust the idea. An educated woman, kawaii. All right? He felt threatened by that. Okay? To make women learned and foxes tame has the same effect, to make them more cunning. Okay? The fox is famously Zurui in English culture. And the women are the same. If you give them an education, they will just become more cunning, more Zurui. So, most women got little education. They might have a basic ability to read if they were high class, but if they were low class, most people, as I say, men or women, couldn't read. And they were trained to be housewives. It may be a little bit surprising then to know that there were actually schools for women. You know, if you were from a rich family, you could send your daughter to school, and people did. There were private boarding schools for girls. The centre for that kind of education was an area that's now part of London called Hackney, and there were several girls' schools at that time in the 17th century. Catherine Phillips, for example, she was a poet, she was a translator in the 17th century. She went to a Presbyterian school. Remember, the Presbyterians were the ones who didn't want the system of bishops. You know, I talked about Presbyterian and Episcopalian. Scotland was basically Presbyterian. England was Episcopalian. It just meant the church system, did they have bishops or not? And she went to that school from the age of 8. Okay, it's a type of Protestant school. A lot of the education would be still connected with Christianity in some way. It was basically a Christian country. And Mrs. Perrich had over 100 schools, over 100 students in her school for girls, and there were several other smaller schools in Hackney and some in other parts of the country. So it's not a complete absence of schools for girls. There are some schools for girls. But basically, what is the purpose of those schools? To teach etiquette, to teach the skills of a high-class wife. Can you imagine what the skills of a high-class wife would be? Do you think, for example, she would need to cook? Not really, no, she wouldn't be in the kitchen, would she? She'd have servants to do the cooking. So it wouldn't be like cooking and housework. What do you think it might be? What sorts of things do you think they would be teaching in a school like that? Any ideas? What would the wife of an elite man be able to do? What would be the qualities that a high-class man would say, oh, she's a good wife for me? What sort of training? What sort of woman? Any ideas? Yeah, they might write poetry. We had an example of Catherine Phillips writing poetry. There were quite a few women who were writing poetry. Yes, yes. Anything else? So yes, I'd say that could be one of the things that women would do. I mean, poetry was still considered a very important form of literature, and most poets were men. But yes, certainly there were women who were trained, who were poets. I wouldn't say it's the most important one on the list, but poetry, yes, poetry is a possible skill. Anything else? Sorry? Dance. Yes, good. Dancing. That's certainly important. She has to be able to dance. All right. She's got to be able to go to those big parties where they're playing music, and she's got to be able to dance elegantly with her partner. Good. Anything else? Yes, well, the piano itself was developed a little bit later on. If you remember, we saw that kind of virginal harpsichord kind of instrument, which was a little bit more basic than a piano. But yes, she would be, if she could play virginals, harpsichord, and then later on, as it developed into the piano. Yeah, and other possibly other instruments, and of course singing. You have to remember, no television, no computers, no keitai. What are they going to do? These rich people who don't work. All right, they've got money. They have to develop, lots and lots of systems of entertainment. And the wives have to be able to provide that entertainment. Okay? One other thing that I put on the list would be, there are several other things. Embroidery. Basically stitching a picture or a pattern. We saw Queen Elizabeth, the cover of that book that she translated. She had stitched a flower pattern onto the front of the book. Okay, embroidery. Women would sit. The men would be talking there about politics or something, or work or something. She'd be sitting there politely, and she'd be doing her embroidery. She wasn't supposed to be getting involved in the conversation about politics or something, but she might be sitting there in the corner doing her embroidery. That was what she was expected to do. And then the results would be put on the walls or they'd be put up somewhere. So embroidery was a typical kind of part of that sort of education. French. French was always the language of the upper class. The 1066, the French came and they were the upper class. For 200 or 300 years, the upper class was basically French-speaking. But French has always been high prestige. Prestige. It's a French word. Prestige. Okay? All of the elegant word. Oh, elegant. Elegant. It's a French word. Okay? All these words that suggest some kind of sophistication. Sophistication. They're all French, okay? And then if she can, in her conversation, she can put in a little French pronunciation or a French expression. Instead of saying there's a suspicion of garlic in this soup, you know, there's a soupçon. Okay, she could use the French word. Okay, put that into her conversation. She sounded high class, she sounded elegant, she sounded sophisticated. And so learning French was part of the training of a high class lady. But it's all grooming her to be a good wife to a high class gentleman. So yes, we've got French, dancing. Well, I put needlework. Basically, that's embroidery, needlework. And yes, some of them, like the Presbyterian school of Mrs. Salmon, would put more emphasis on religion and morality. Okay, so that would be important as well. Not in every school, but some of them. The idea that women should be moral, they should be good Christian women. So yeah, religion would be another possible part of their training. Even the way to walk, you know, you've got that image. They have to be able to walk around and keep the book on their head. Okay, that sort of thing. But they wouldn't be learning the hard science subjects and the mathematics and the things that boys would be learning. And there were also charity schools for girls. The Red Maids School in Bristol is still there. It's still a school. It's not a charity school in the same way as it was before, but it's still there. And they would be set up by a rich person who, when he died, or possibly when she died, would say, I want to give my money to a charity, to a school for poor children in my area. Could be a school for boys. Usually it would be a school for boys, but just sometimes it would be somebody said, no, I want a school for girls. So Red Maids School in Bristol, which is the oldest girls' school that we still, that's still open in England, was set up as a kind of charity, as a charity school. And the city mayor set it up for 40 poor women children. That's early modern spelling with the E on the end of poor, okay? So there would be a few schools of that kind. And of course, these schools, they wouldn't be teaching these things so much because they were poor children. The basic thing would be get them reading, get them writing, get them sort of learning the basics, give them a basic education. And then there was another type of school which was called a dame school, which was a sort of small private school for younger children. And this would be usually for boys and girls. And there was no national policy. So it just depended. If there was an old lady who could read or write, very often she would, or even not necessarily old, she might be younger, but she had got an education and she could teach basic reading and writing to small children. And usually children would go locally to such a lady. They would go to her house. She would have 9 or 10 children. The class might just last 1 or 2 hours a day. They probably didn't spend all day in those schools. They would go and have their class, then they'd go home. Children worked, of course, quite often in the fields and things like that, so they might, after doing their work for their family, they might go and spend an hour in the dame school. And that was the way that people, both boys and girls, were able to get a basic education through those kinds of institutions. But it was a personal initiative. Somebody would say, "I want to do that," and they can pay me a penny when they come to their class, to my class, and that way they'd earn a little bit of money for themselves. But there was no national policy. Okay? As I say, no, the national policy for education didn't really develop until the 19th century in Britain. And, of course, home education was a big thing for boys and girls in the early modern period. Some would go abroad to study, but the basic idea, and women themselves believed it, that too much education would not be good for them. Quite a lot of women would have agreed with James I. Too much education would make us unsuitable to be wives, unsuitable to be mothers. So quite a lot of women themselves believed that education was not necessarily the best thing for them. That what they needed was to learn how to be good wives to their husbands. Moving on to the middle, and so I'm mostly talking about the earlier part of the 17th century. Then, because they are mostly just teaching this kind of etiquette and polite behaviour for high-class women, you start to get women like Hannah Woolley and Batsua Makin setting up their own schools, which are aiming to give women an education that's closer to the education that men are getting. Now, again, that doesn't really completely start happening in England until the 19th century, that women can get an equal education to men. But this is moving in that direction. Woolley herself came from a family that was skilled in medicine, and she set up a school with her husband. The situation there was that it was her brothers who'd learned medicine, and she just went along with them. She just learned with them. She just sat with her brothers and learned what they were learning. She wasn't being given the education herself, but she went in and took it. And so that in that way, she became educated in medicine. And Makin was a linguist, and she was a tutor to the daughter of Charles I. So she had a high prestige position teaching the daughter of the king. And she set up her own school in Tottenham later on in the 1670s. So focusing on women's ability to speak not just French but other languages and give them a more general education. And not just that, but grammar, rhetoric, logic, languages, mathematics, geography, history, music, painting, and poetry were on her advertised syllabus. So mathematics, geography, history, logic, rhetoric, grammar. These things most schools were not teaching to women. All right, they would, as I say, learn a bit of music, a bit of painting perhaps, a bit of poetry, a bit of French, as I've said, things that would be kind of useful for them to be wives of high-class men. So she's aiming for something much more general. And so we're starting to get more schools that are giving an education that's not just a training to be the wife of a high-class gentleman. Even so, women are not allowed. For example, Woolley with her medical training, her brothers could become doctors, but she couldn't. She was a woman. Okay. The first woman who became a doctor in the 19th century was more or less a mistake. They didn't realize she was a woman. And, oh, she's a woman. Oh, but I've got the piece of paper. You can't take it away from me. So she became the first woman by accident who became a doctor. But theoretically, women weren't allowed to, even in the 19th century. And again, even in the 19th century, they weren't allowed to go to university. Okay, my university didn't start giving a degree to Cambridge, didn't give a degree to women until the 1940s, after World War II. Okay, less than 100 years ago, women could not graduate from Cambridge University. Oxford was earlier. So yeah, Oxford was a little bit more advanced in that, but Cambridge was very slow. And women, even in the 19th century, the same was true. They couldn't join the professions. They couldn't become, a doctor, for example. They couldn't become a lawyer. Okay, all those kinds of positions were completely closed to women. However educated they might become, they could not do those kinds of jobs. And they could not go to university, so it would be the same thing. Okay, and this continues up to the middle of the 19th century. It continues to be like that, or even middle or late 19th century. Okay, and then slowly women become accepted in those positions. It's difficult to imagine now that it would be quiche for you people to be here. Okay, in those days, even in the 19th century. So I think it's interesting to look at the way that women start to become active during this time of civil war and what happens during the period of Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans. Because, as I said, this is not a good time for women. The Puritans basically did not like women. And it was an extraordinary time. And one of the extraordinary things about that time that is often not talked about in the history books is that women started to become a political force. Women actually were standing up and protesting, and women were making their voice heard. In 1642, all right, remember this is when the Civil War is starting. Great multitudes of women marched on Parliament, proclaiming that where there is one woman now here, there will be 500 tomorrow, and that it was as good for them to die here as at home. Stop this fighting. Okay, they basically went out onto the streets, they went onto Parliament, hundreds of them, saying, we do not agree with what the government is doing. We're against this civil war. Stop it. Mostly because they felt it was damaging for the economy. It was getting hard to make money for their family. So they're going out and saying, look, people don't want to buy our things, in France or Germany because, we can't sell our stuff and we can't make our stuff because you people are killing everybody around the place. You're fighting and it's not stable. We need a stable society so that we can feed our children and have a stable life. So they went out onto the streets and they protested. Okay? As I say, mostly they were the wives and widows. In this case, they were the wives and widows of traders. They were worried that Parliament's opposition to the king is going to lead to a loss of trade and that it's going to be harder to do business. So they've got it's an economic reason for protesting. They're not really interested in the politics. They're just worried that they're not going to be able to feed their children. But it's very important that they go out into the streets and they protest like that. And then over 5,000 women marched on Parliament demanding an end to the Civil War the following year. Wow. It's something that you don't often read about in the history books. I didn't learn this when I was at school or university. I found it out, researching it later on. Okay? That's what I mean when I say his story. They don't talk about what the women were doing very much at that time, but they were doing surprising things, because that was a very brave thing to do. It wasn't just, oh, let's go out and protest and maybe the police will lock us, maybe we'll get locked up and be put in prison for the night or something. No, the punishments, as we know, in those days could be very, very severe. And women in particular were targets. It's new, it's surprising, and it's very brave that women stood up and protested in that way. They didn't succeed. They largely failed to get what they want. The Civil War carried on, for example. They didn't get what they wanted, but they tried. And I think that's a very important thing to notice. Because, as I say, they were standing up to Puritans, and the personal risk was huge. We've got witch hunts going on. Women who cause trouble could be killed, they could be punished in all kinds of nasty ways. And yet, in spite of that, thousands of them went to Parliament and stood outside Parliament protesting openly. Okay. You see, I think that when we talk about feminism, when people talk about the history of feminism, they usually start with Jukuseki, the 19th century. But look at what's going on here in the 17th century. Okay, again, I think people often don't think about the power of women and the powerful actions that they took in a much earlier period. Okay, when we talk about feminism, we're usually hearing about, the 19th century, Mary Wollstonecraft to late 18th century. This is going on much earlier. And as I say, it's a time of great risk. I'll talk about that again a little bit more later on. But these Protestant sects, the Puritans were mostly pretty against women. Why? Well, because of the Bible, Adam and Eve, it's Eve who takes the apple, that sort of thing. But not all of the Protestant sects were opposed to women. One of them, in particular, was the Quakers. The early Quakers were very, very open in their way of thinking about women. In the Bible, it said, "Let your women keep silence in the churches." And they chose to understand women here meaning flesh. It meant men and women should be silent if they're speaking from the flesh. If they're speaking from the spirit, men and women should speak. Radical. Okay, in fact, really, it's not what the Bible says. They're changing what the Bible says because of what they believe. But anybody can be full of the Spirit to be close to God. And that those people should speak, and the other ones should shut up, men or women. So we've got women standing up like this and preaching in early Quaker religious services. This is radical. This is new. One of the general members of the public who was, he didn't like this, so he went and he's saying to her, look, you shouldn't be talking in the church. It says in the Bible you shouldn't talk. And she says, thou art the woman, for thou art flesh. You're just speaking from the body. So that makes you a woman. That is weak. And therefore, thou art means you are. Thou art to keep silence. And I may speak because I have the Spirit. But thou hast not the Spirit, you do not have the Spirit, and therefore hold thy babbling. Shut up. Okay? So this is a woman speaking like this to a man in the 17th century. This is really actually very shocking because she can be punished, and many of them were punished very, very severely for speaking such words. Now we talk about feminism and bravery and, women standing up. These people were taking a huge risk. Okay, they were taking a really big risk. They are, firstly, look at the way that they are experimenting with the idea of gender. They're separating gender from biological sex. They're saying a man is a woman when he speaks from the body. A woman is a man when she speaks from the spirit. It's not about, my biology. It's about what's happening inside me. This is something that people never thought about before. I mean, even now, it's a big debate. It is the big debate that's going on now in society. What is gender and gender identity? They're hundreds of years before this. They're open to this idea. Quaker women would be whipped. They would be put in prison. When this woman, who spoke like that to a man, the judge would say, you should be at home washing dishes. Okay, you should not be speaking like that to men. And she would be severely punished. For example, okay, she'd have this thing put on her head. She'd be led with a rope, and she'd be hit with that stick all around the town. Okay, it's got a bit on it like a horse has to stop her from speaking. Okay, Quaker women and other women who spoke up would be punished in this kind of way. All right. Silence them by force. Okay. So women who spoke up, I think they were much braver than the women in the 19th century who spoke up, because those punishments by the 19th century, they didn't exist. To speak up in that situation, that's real bravery. Okay. So I think, women and the history of feminism doesn't think enough about these women in the 17th century and what they did. Okay, I think it was a big thing. Okay, and then we come to the late 17th century. Remember what he said, kind of party time, and we all just want to have fun. Okay, the king wants to have fun, the women, everybody wants to have fun after the Puritans have gone. So the conditions for women start to get better at this time. We get Margaret Cavendish, one of the first women who is really properly a scientist. Okay, she's a philosopher, she's an astronomer, she's mixing with the very famous scientists and philosophers of her time, Hobbes, Descartes, Robert Boyle. She's a particularly famous example. But she was very widely criticized by her enemies who said, you know, a woman should not be doing these things. A woman should not be in this place. So she's, you know, an example of it was possible for a woman to be a scientist. It was possible for a woman to reach that kind of level. But for most women, things weren't changing very much. Okay, very little change of development for women in general. Okay, very little real change. We got some exceptional women, but for most women, things aren't developing all that much at this time. We've got the charity schools. Sorry, I put this together from two different presentations. I put it together, so I'm a little bit repeating Mary Makin here and things. I'll forget about most of this, but sorry, I'm repeating from before, aren't I? I've put two presentations together and I've just repeated the same thing twice. So we're getting some development, but for most people things aren't changing all that much. There might be something on the prints to fill in here, but kinishinakuti, okay, because I've already said this stuff. Yes, ほとんど。ちょっと私のミスですね。It's the same stuff as I put in before. So let's move on a little bit, and I hope we're going to move on. We start to develop another big area of boarding school for girls in another part of London, in Chelsea, which even today, Chelsea is a fashionable part of London. And another important name for us, Mary Astell, who came from Newcastle. She went to live in Chelsea in 1688. And it's kind of interesting to focus on Mary Astell because she had a circle of friends who were all kind of pretty high-level, educated, powerful group of women in the late 17th century here. We've got Mary Chudley, a poet. We've got Elizabeth Thomas, who taught herself Latin. We've got Lady Montagu, who introduced the smallpox vaccination. We've got Judith Drake, who wrote an essay in defense of the female sex. Ooh. Okay? This is 100 years before Mary Wollstonecraft writing her Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is the famous sort of, everybody says, oh, that's the first feminist text. Hey guys, what about this? All right, we've got these sorts of things going on, and we've got Elizabeth Elstob, Anglo-Saxon scholar. We've got some pretty big, educated, big names here among women in the late 17th century. So among the elite, you know, among the kind of educated elite, certainly women are getting much more power than they had before, much more, they are having much more influence than they had before, right? They're publishing their work, they're having an effect on society, introducing the smallpox vaccination. Here, that's important, because it was a major killer, right? So there's a development of a women's sort of circle going on in the later part of the 17th century. And Mary Astell herself wrote, "If all men are born free, why are all women born slaves?" If that isn't feminist thinking, what is it? Okay? So we're starting to get direct feminist thinking coming out in the late 17th century. And actually, even in the 16th century, there are one or two texts that we could describe as feminist. So feminism, in fact, I think if we look through history carefully, we'll find that there's been feminism all through history. So in conclusion, we don't get that word feminism in English until the middle of the 19th century, and I've mentioned Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women, which was published at the end of the 18th century. That's often taken as being the first feminist treatise. Well, as you can see, it wasn't. And I think, why is Mary Wollstonecraft's work so famous? What is it different in any way from what these writers are saying 100 years before? People like Mary Astle. Well, if I had to try to explain what the difference was, I think it's this. Proto-feminism, which I'll take here. Proto means kind of early or at the very beginning. This is not on the prints or anything, so it is a separate piece of information really that I'm giving you here. It mostly sees women's rights as a kind of reward for good behavior. All right. Mary Wollstonecraft goes further. She's saying that women's rights are they are rights, not a reward, but a right that everybody should have. Not just good women. All women should have those rights. It's not about being good. She says, you don't give rights to men because they're good. They get rights because they're men. Okay? So women should have rights just because they're alive, not because they're good. Why should they have to be good to get rights? She herself lived a most scandalous life. Okay? And her point is that men can live any kind of morality, but they have a man who is moral and a man who is immoral, they all have the same rights. Why should only good women get rights? So I think that's the difference. Okay, that's what makes Mary Wollstonecraft stand out a little bit from people like Mary Astle, these 17th and early 18th century writers. But basically, yeah, we've got a lot of feminism going on even in those early days. So the basic idea for both Mary Wollstonecraft and for the proto-feminists of the late 17th and the early 18th century, the basic idea was education. It all focused around education. You have to give women an education that is not just a training for marriage, not just a kind of school of etiquette. You have to give them a real education. Once you start giving women a real education, then women will move forward. Because, of course, the argument was always, oh, women, You can't talk to them about politics, you can't talk to them about science, because their head is full of silly ideas about romance or silly stuff. Well, if that's the only thing they've been shown, then of course that's all they know. Give them the same kind of input as boys get, and they will be equally intelligent, they will be just as able, but it has to start with education. And that's the common point all the way through here, that first wave feminism, or early feminism, the basic point at the beginning of feminism is women need equal education. All right, that's the basic point. So I think that's really more or less it. As I say, women like Astle, Chudley, Drake, they're often ignored. And we don't get enough coverage in the history books of the thinking that those kinds of people had, and the effect that they had on changing people's thinking about women and their place in society. Because we're going to see, if we carry on into the 18th century, we're going to see, women are starting to take their place more and more and more in society. So, yeah, basically that's it then. We've got, again, I've talked more about the schools that were there for women. Most history books are sort of assuming that women didn't get any education, but when you research it, you find that's not quite true. But there were schools. For example, charity schools, dames' schools, girls' boarding schools. There were these kinds of schools around. But the big issue is not that they didn't get education. The big issue is what kind of education, and the fact that education remained basically a training for marriage. It was a kind of fashionable education, not a practical one. Okay. Yeah, that's about it. Okay. And if you want to find out more about that topic, I think there's a really good online resource, the British History Online, Private Education from the 16th Century. And for early modern women, it's published in the 1990s, but English women's voices of that period, 1540 to 1700, that's another great resource if you're interested in this subject, okay? All right, well, I'll leave that there then.